Somewhere over Central Asia right now, Air Force Two is carrying J.D. Vance toward what may be the most consequential diplomatic meeting an American vice president has attended since the Camp David Accords. Below him, the world is holding its breath. Oil markets are twitching with every headline. 10,000 Pakistani security personnel have locked down Islamabad. Iran is expected to send Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who has already declared that a Lebanon ceasefire and the release of frozen Iranian assets must happen before talks can even begin. And back in Washington, a former member of the National Security Council just went on Fox News and said quietly and clearly that he thinks the U.S. is going back to war. His name wasn't shouted, his prediction wasn't in a chyron, but it was the most important thing said on American television today.
And good morning. Diplomacy kicking into overdrive. Let's see what we get from this one. Moments ago, there's the video of the Vice President, J.D. Vance, boarding Air Force Two, heading for Islamabad, Pakistan, for high-stakes talks with Iran. High stakes, he said. Can they create an agreement that will end the war once and for all? So it doesn't get bigger than this. Good morning, everybody, on a Friday. I'm Bill Hemmer. Big 2 hours coming up right now.
It's high stakes with hot takes.
Yes, indeed. I like that hashtag.
It'll be all weekend. I'm Dana Perino, and this is America's Newsroom. Before the vice president took off, he took an upbeat tone on those talks, but also warning Iran, don't even think about pulling a fast one.
We're looking forward to the negotiation. I think it's going to be positive. We'll, of course, see. As the President of the United States said, if the Iranians are willing to negotiate in good faith, we're certainly willing to extend the open hand. If they're going to try to play us, then they're going to find that the negotiating team is not that receptive. So we're going to try to have a positive negotiation. The President has gave us some pretty clear guidelines, and we're going to see. So I hope you guys have a safe flight. We'll certainly take some questions later on. But for now, let's get on the plane and hit the road.
So now President Trump flatly rejecting Iran's first proposal, now pushing for a stronger deal. That deal would include putting a laser focus on one of the toughest issues on the table, and that's the fate of the Strait of Hormuz. Days into a fragile ceasefire, that key waterway has become what Iran sees as its biggest bargaining chip. It's still choking off the movement of many ships, deciding which ones can and cannot flow freely.
Overnight, President Trump posted on Truth Social saying Iran is doing a very poor job, dishonorable, some would say, of allowing oil to go through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the agreement we have.
So meanwhile, Dana, another potential stumbling block is the conflict ongoing in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Israel continues to hit Hezbollah, Iran's largest and to date most powerful proxy. That regime insisting that any move to exclude this from the ceasefire talk is a non-starter for them.
And Peter Doocy and Trey Yingst have been covering this story from the get-go. They join us from the White House and from Tel Aviv. And Peter, let's start with you. Any other word about how the president advised J.D. Vance before he took off?
Well, when J.D. Vance says that the president gave them clear guidelines, we understand that to mean that the U.S. needs to go in there and tell Iran no enrichment, period. That is what we have heard from White House officials. Remember, about 6 weeks ago, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were sitting there with the Iranians and said, the U.S. will give you all the uranium you want for peaceful purposes. You just can't use it to enrich a bomb. And Iran said no. Now they are, of course, adding J.D. Vance to the equation. And so we'll see how things go. We don't even really know what the format is yet. They had indirect talks last time. These will be TBD.
Okay, so from the White House, we move to Tel Aviv and Trey Yingst. What has happened there in the last 12 hours, Trey?
Yeah, Bill, a lot of developments here in the Middle East over the past 12 hours. We know the Israelis and the Lebanese government are entering into direct talks next week in Washington to try and develop peaceful relations between the two countries and disarm Iran's largest proxy in the region, Hezbollah. The Iranians are tying strikes against Hezbollah directly to the negotiations this week in Islamabad. And so there are three really major issues we're looking at here. That's Iran's support of regional proxies and whether or not they're going to tie the success and outcome of these negotiations to support of Hezbollah. We're also looking at the Strait of Hormuz, where since the ceasefire began, anywhere from 8 to 11 vessels have been able to pass through. And Israeli intelligence officials tell Fox News the Iranians are demanding fees of those vessels that are making it through this critical waterway. And then finally, you have this issue of enriched uranium. Despite the fact that earlier this week, President Trump said there was an agreement to go into Iranian territory in the future and dig up that enriched uranium that was buried in the aftermath of Operation Midnight Hammer and then remove it from the country, Iran's nuclear chief this week said they will maintain the right to enrich uranium. And so a lot of points to work out here at the negotiating table. And the question here is whether or not the Iranians are willing to make a good faith deal.
And then, Peter, how is the White House processing the increase in oil prices, the concern people have going forward, and, of course, the inflation report today?
Dana, they are eager to change the subject to something else. Nobody here is saying that high gas prices are not a problem. They are saying that high gas prices will only be a problem for a little bit. But in terms of changing the subject, next week they're going to send the president to Arizona and Nevada. It's tax week. They want to talk about all the help that no tax on tips and no tax on overtimes has for blue-collar workers, Trump supporters or not. Something else interesting about this dynamic, though, they are sending J.D. Vance, a tale as old as time. Sometimes presidents give the hardest possible jobs to their vice presidents. We saw Biden do this with Harris when he said, "You're in charge of the border." President Trump sending J.D. Vance here gives the president an opportunity, if things go great, to say, "I delegated well." And if things go poorly, to say, well, maybe I'll get involved next time.
Okay, Trey, one more thing on what's happening in Lebanon, because those talks begin early next week in Washington, D.C. And from what I understand here, you've got the Israeli government and maybe the Lebanese government trying to squeeze Hezbollah in Lebanon. And part of the reason they could do that is if the Lebanese government now in power recognizes Israel. Is that a possibility now for that region?
Yeah, we've seen a huge shift in tone from the Lebanese government as a result of direct efforts by the Trump administration. The fact that during this conflict, you had the Lebanese prime minister call on Hezbollah to lay down their arms and stop firing toward Israel is something unheard of. Had we told you this 2 years ago, people would have laughed because there was such a connection and Hezbollah was deeply embedded into the Lebanese government. The reality is the president's been able to change the focus of the Middle East from eternal conflict to trying to find some mediation efforts toward a broader ceasefire deal that doesn't just affect the situation inside Gaza between Israel and Hamas and doesn't just affect the situation in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, but a broader plan for the region that would allow things here to stabilize. And again, this is part of the reason that Operation Epic Fury began. The president was very clear. Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, despite the fact that they initially came to the negotiating table and said they had enough enriched uranium for 11 nuclear bombs. And so one of the largest hurdles in the region was considered the IRGC and the threat that the regime posed. And now that that has been largely degraded in the aftermath of these U.S. and Israeli strikes, it opens up a possibility for the Middle East where you could start to see more negotiation taking place and normalization deals across the board that would bring in countries like Lebanon to try and make peace with Israel.
All right, Trey Yingst, Peter Doocy, you're going to have busy days, and we thank you for your expertise.
It is 3D chess, and it's the Middle East, and Michael Allen knows it well, former NSC Senior Director. Michael, welcome to our coverage here. So we're balancing two different plates here. Now you've got the Washington talks with regard to Hezbollah and Lebanon. You've got the Pakistani talks with regard to the United States and Iran. Here's Jack Keane earlier today on that.
President Trump is not going to make a bad deal here. As much as he thinks there's a good deal coming, doesn't know for sure until it's on the table and what are the verification process. He knows these guys are liars and cheaters. Listen, nobody has negotiated more with this regime than this president. And this is the only president who's ever taken them on consequentially in terms of military operations.
So, Michael, let's start in Pakistan with regard to Iran. What do you rate as what are the chances that these talks actually can produce a lasting peace?
Well, the stakes have definitely gotten higher for Vice President Vance. I'm certain that the president has given him the charge to threaten the resumption of military force unless Iran agrees to at the very least, the loose terms we had worked out earlier in the week. We have to be clear with the Iranians that they do not have a veto over who gets through the Straits of Hormuz, and that it ought to be reestablished as a free and open international waters passageway. Anything short of that gives them control over energy and, by extension, sort of a veto, sort of a control over the world economy. That's unacceptable. We've got to get it back on track, and I can't think of anything that they'd be interested in unless it's the renewed prospect of military force, which they should want to avoid.
I mean, I think to me, that's where it all comes down to. I joked yesterday it was the Strait of no moves, because the agreement, as President Trump just said in his truth, it's like, that's not the agreement we had. But if you're a dying regime because of all the things that have just happened to you, and all of a sudden you have the most important leverage you've ever had in your existence, why would you give that up?
So I really don't think they're going to give it up at the negotiating table. They may come out of this weekend with some language that we'll try to finesse. Maybe we'll get the Chinese and others to try and weigh in with the Iranians. But I think honestly, I think we're going to have to go back to a situation where the United States is degrading Iran's coastal defenses near the Strait of Hormuz. We've been busily degrading other things across the country the last 5 weeks. But that will enable, we think, the CENTCOM commander to say to the commander-in-chief, we've now reduced the threat enough to where we can do a freedom of navigation operation, establish that it's back open, and hopefully be able to do an escort mission to start bringing tankers through. If they're not going to let it go.
Sorry, Michael, that means we go back to war, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid so. I mean, let's see what happens this weekend. We've got I'm sure we have a very effective message. And so Vance has got a lot of pressure on him here.
Yeah.
All right. Michael Allen, thank you. We'll be in touch.
By the hour. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube, and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.
I'm afraid so. The analyst, identified in the segment as Michael, a former NSC senior director, was asked by Bill Hemmer whether degrading Iran's coastal defenses near the Strait of Hormuz meant going back to war. His answer, yeah, I'm afraid so. Let's see what happens this weekend. He laid out his reasoning with the calm precision of someone who has sat in the rooms where these decisions get made. Iran will not voluntarily surrender control of the strait at the negotiating table. It is the only leverage a devastated regime has left. Ghalibaf has already set preconditions that the U.S. won't meet. Therefore, the most likely path to reopening the strait involves resumed military operations, specifically degrading the coastal missile batteries and IRGC positions that allow Iran to threaten tanker traffic. I really don't think they're going to give it up at the negotiating table, he said. We're going to have to go back to a situation where the United States is degrading Iran's coastal defenses near the Strait of Hormuz. Dana Perino, to her credit, identified the core paradox immediately. If you're a dying regime because of all the things that have just happened to you, and all of a sudden you have the most important leverage you've ever had in your existence, why would you give that up? Nobody had a good answer. Because there isn't one. 3 negotiations, 3 cities, 1 impossible puzzle. What this segment revealed, through its reporting rather than its commentary, is that the war's endgame has fragmented into 3 separate diplomatic tracks happening simultaneously, each dependent on the others, none under any single party's control. Islamabad, this weekend. Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner sit across from Iran's remaining leadership. Core issues: nuclear enrichment, Strait of Hormuz sovereignty, sanctions relief. Peter Doocy reported that the U.S. position is no enrichment, period. Iran must accept all uranium for peaceful purposes from external sources and cannot enrich domestically. Iran's nuclear chief said this week they will retain the right to enrich. That is a gap that cannot be split. Washington, next week. Israel and Lebanon enter direct talks, a development Trey Yingst correctly identified as extraordinary. The Lebanese prime minister has called on Hezbollah to lay down their arms and stop firing toward Israel, something unheard of even 2 years ago. The goal, disarmament of Hezbollah and potentially recognition of Israel by Lebanon. But Hezbollah's Secretary General said just yesterday that resistance continues as long as there is breath. The strait itself, ongoing. 8 to 11 vessels have passed through since the ceasefire. Israeli intelligence officials tell Fox News that Iran is demanding fees from vessels transiting the waterway. Trump says that's not the agreement. Iran says it's managing the strait. The gap between open and managed is the gap between peace and war. These three tracks are interlinked in ways that make each harder to resolve. Iran ties Lebanon to the Strait talks. The U.S. says Lebanon isn't part of the deal. Israel says it won't stop hitting Hezbollah. Iran says if Israel doesn't stop, the Strait closes. If the Strait closes, the ceasefire collapses. If the ceasefire collapses, the ammunition Trump is loading onto warships right now gets used. Peter Doocy's observation about vice presidents. Doocy made a casually devastating point about the political dynamics of sending Vance. Sometimes presidents give the hardest possible jobs to their vice presidents. Biden did this with Harris on the border. This gives the president an opportunity, if things go great, to say, I delegated well. And if things go poorly, to say, well, maybe I'll get involved next time. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition. Trump himself has acknowledged he and Vance are philosophically a little bit different on the Iran war. Vance reportedly expressed internal reservations about the strikes before they began. He is now leading the negotiation to end a war he may not have fully supported. That dynamic could produce a better outcome. A negotiator genuinely motivated to find an off-ramp might be more creative than a true believer. Or it could produce a weaker one. If Iran senses division between the vice president and the president, they may try to exploit it. From Tel Aviv, Yingst identified the three core sticking points with surgical clarity. 1. Iran's support of regional proxies, and whether Tehran will tie the Islamabad negotiations to Hezbollah's fate in Lebanon. They already have. 2. The Strait of Hormuz and the gap between what Trump says was agreed, complete, immediate, safe opening, and what Iran is doing, charging fees, requiring military coordination, limiting traffic to a handful of ships. 3. The enriched uranium and the contradiction between Trump's earlier claim that the U.S. and Iran agreed to dig up and remove all of the deeply buried nuclear dust, and Iran's nuclear chief saying this week that they retain the right to enrich. Yingst's framing question, whether or not the Iranians are willing to make a good faith deal, is the right one. But it's also the question that has been asked about every round of U.S.-Iran negotiations for 47 years. The answer has always been the same. It depends on who you're asking, when you're asking, and what they think they can get away with. Retired General Jack Keane, one of the most respected military voices in American media, was quoted in the segment saying, "Nobody has negotiated more with this regime than this president, and this is the only president who's ever taken them on conventionally in terms of military operation." Both statements are factually accurate. Trump did negotiate extensively with Iran in his first term, withdrew from the JCPOA, and imposed maximum pressure sanctions. He is also the first American president to launch a sustained conventional military campaign against Iran. But Keane's framing omitted a critical context. The Arms Control Association concluded that the U.S. negotiating team, specifically Witkoff, did not have sufficient technical expertise or diplomatic experience to engage in effective diplomacy, and that his mischaracterization of Iran's positions and nuclear program likely informed Trump's assessment that talks were not progressing. In other words, the president who has negotiated the most with Iran may also be the president whose negotiators understood the least about what they were negotiating. Witkoff and Kushner are real estate developers. The nuclear file is not a real estate deal. And the man who just landed in Islamabad to lead the most important diplomatic mission of the century is a 41-year-old former senator with no prior foreign policy negotiating experience. That doesn't mean they'll fail. But it means the stakes are not just high. They are being carried by people operating at the extreme edge of their expertise against adversaries who have been negotiating nuclear issues for decades. Trump told the New York Post the outcome should become clear in about 24 hours. Another clock, another deadline, another moment where the world waits to see if the gap between threat and action closes or opens. The ceasefire is 3 days old. The Strait is barely trickling. Lebanon is burning. The ammunition ships are being loaded. Iran's remaining leaders are insisting on conditions the U.S. won't meet. And a vice president who privately had reservations about this war is now responsible for ending it. Perino asked the question that none of the panelists could answer. If you're a dying regime with the only leverage you've ever had, why would you give it up? The former NSC official gave the honest answer. They probably won't. And that means, in his assessment, the bombs come back. I'm afraid so. 3 words, spoken quietly on a Friday morning. The most important forecast anyone has made about this war in 6 weeks. We'll know if he's right by tomorrow. Bye.